Marin had not woken that morning intending to feed the most dangerous alpha in the Seven Valleys. She had intended to peel turnips. A great many turnips, if she was honest, because the autumn stores had come in bruised, and Mistress Vesna trusted no one else to cut the rot out without wasting the good flesh underneath. And yet here she was, in the great hall of Vaskold, one trembling clay bowl held out in both hands, watching the King of Embervale eat, as though he had not eaten in a year, because, as it turned out, she could see everything from this close, the sharp jut of his cheekbones, where there should have been the broad, heavy face of a warlord, the way his hand shook just slightly around the horn spoon, the gray at his temples that had no business being there on a man barely past 30. King Rurik Vaskar had ended the Salt Ridge Rebellion by himself, on foot, in a single night. The songs still refused to describe in detail. He was supposed to be a mountain wearing a crown. Up close he looked like a mountain that had been hollowed out from the inside and was trying very hard not to show it. He swallowed. He took another mouthful. And another. The scrape of the spoon against the bottom of her cheap little bowl was the only sound in a hall built to hold 400. Marin did not dare breathe. This was not how the afternoon was supposed to go. There had been a procession. That was the word for it. A procession, as if food were a coronation. The finest cooks of the Seven Valleys had come to Vaskhold at the King's Council's desperate summons, each bearing a masterpiece. Roast venison lacquered in wild honey, a soup, the color of sunset that a man had wept while ladling, pheasant deboned and rebuilt inside a crust, shaped like a pheasant which Marin privately thought was doing too much. One by one they had knelt, one by one they had offered. And one by one the king had turned his face away, and the great gray wolf that lived beneath his skin, the wolf every soul in that hall could feel, pressing at the edges of the room like weather, had refused. He had refused 30 bowls. Marin had counted, because counting was easier than thinking about why she had been dragged up from the scullery in the first place. She had seen the wolf refuse the honey-lacquered venison. She had felt the whole hall flinch, when the great gray presence beneath the king's skin turned its face from the weeping man's sunset soup, not with anger, but with a bone-deep, incurable disinterest, the way a dying man turns from a window. 30 of the finest dishes in the realm, and the wolf had looked at every one of them and found nothing there worth living for. It had happened by accident. That was the part no one would ever believe. A steward, with panic in his eyes, had come tearing down to the kitchens after the 30th failure, shouting that they needed anything at all, and Vesna, who did not panic, who had never once in Marin's memory panicked, had thrust the nearest full bowl into Marin's hands and shoved her toward the stairs. It was nothing. It was the staff's own supper. Barley, marrow bones, the bruised turnips, a fistful of the wild thyme that grew in the cracks of the kitchen wall where Marin always let it. Peasant food. The food you made when you loved people who had no money. She had walked the length of that hall on legs that did not feel like hers, certain she was about to be executed for insulting a king with turnips. She had lifted the bowl. She had not even managed to say, "Your Majesty," before the wolf in him went very, very still, and then he had taken it from her hands and eaten. Now, Counselor Bram had gone the color of old cheese. A serving girl, by the far wall, had both hands pressed over her mouth. The court cooks, the great artists of the royal kitchens, were staring at Marin's chapped fingers and her plain gray apron with an expression she would remember for the rest of her life, because it was the expression of people watching the world reorder itself and hating every second of it. Across the hall, near the doors, stood the king's beta, a lean, watchful man with a scar through one eyebrow, whom she would later learn was named Dagon. He caught her eye, and very slowly, very deliberately, he mouthed 3 words at her. "Do not move." Easy for him to say. He was not the one whose arms had started to ache from holding a bowl perfectly still while a starving wolf king ate out of it like it was the last food in the world. She did not move. She barely breathed. She stared at a moth-eaten banner on the far wall and thought about turnips, about the scullery, about anything at all that was not the fact that the king had just closed his eyes over her cheap little supper, as though it were mercy itself. When the bowl was empty, he set the spoon down, with great care, as if it might shatter. For a long moment, he simply looked at it. Then he looked at her, and Marin discovered that his eyes were a pale, exhausted gray, and that being looked at by them felt like standing too close to a fire. You did not get to decide whether it warmed you or burned you. That was up to the fire. "Who made this?" he said. It was not a question. His voice had gravel in it. Marin opened her mouth. Nothing came out. "She did, sire," said Doggin smoothly, appearing at her shoulder from nowhere the way Betis seemed able to do. A cook of the household. The king kept looking at her. Something moved behind his eyes that she could not name and would spend a great many sleepless nights trying to. "Leave us," he said to the hall. "All of you now." They left. Of course they left. And in the doorway, before a guard steered her out into the corridor with a hand that was not gentle, Dagon leaned in close and said the thing that would keep her awake that night. "Whatever you did," he murmured, "you tell no one you did it. Do you understand me? Not the other cooks, not Vesna. No one. Stay in the kitchens. I will come for you." "Is he going to be angry?" Marin whispered. But Dagon was already gone, and the door was already closing, and Marin was left standing alone in a cold stone corridor with her empty bowl and the dawning, terrible understanding that she had just done something that was not supposed to be possible. That night, she dreamed she was hauled before the whole court to answer for the crime of feeding the king turnips. And bruised ones at that, the Dream King said, right before the axe came down. She woke with her sheets knotted around her ankles, and gray light at the window, and someone knocking on the scullery door. A guard stood in the passage, his face carefully blank. "You're wanted," he said, "by the king himself." The room they put her in to wait was small and windowless, and smelled of tallow and fear, her own mostly. Marin sat on the single hard bench, and tried to remember every rule of court she had ever heard from the older cooks, and found that all of them had abandoned her the way friends do at the worst possible moment. When the door opened, it was Dagon, and her heart flung itself into her throat and stayed there. "Mistress Marin," he said, which was absurd, because no one had ever called her mistress anything in her life. "Just Marin," she managed. "Is it true? Am I really being summoned by the king?" "Almost," Dagon said, and shut the door behind him. "I've summoned you, in his name. There's a difference, though I'll grant you it's a fine one." He studied her with those watchful eyes. "I'd like you to cook a meal, today, for the king, in private. Call it an experiment, if you like." She stared at him. "Why?" It came out as a squeak. Dagon did not answer that. Instead, he opened the door again and gestured her through. And the walk that followed felt exactly like the walk to an execution, which Marin was beginning to think might become a theme of her life. "He's going to recognize me," she thought, half running to keep up with the beta's long stride. "He's going to remember, he's going to know, I'm the nobody who fed him barley and turnips in front of the entire court." They did not go to the great hall. They went down and down again, through passages Marin had never seen, until they came to a small private chamber with a hearth already lit, and a heavy oak table scrubbed pale by years of use. And, behind the table, in a plain chair, head bent over a stack of correspondence, sat King Rurik Faskar. He did not look up. He did not acknowledge the door. He did not so much as twitch when Marin came in on legs that had turned to water. "Does he know?" she thought wildly. "Does he remember? Is he angry?" "There's everything you'll need," Dagon said, and only then did she notice the far end of the room. A second hearth, a cook's bench, a shelf of ingredients, arranged with more care than she had ever been permitted in the household kitchens. Good flour, fresh marrow bones, a little clay pot of the wild thyme, cut that morning. She could smell it from here. Someone had gone to a great deal of trouble. "Cook," Dagon said simply, "whatever you made yesterday, then we wait." So Marin cooked. Her hands shook for the first few minutes, and then, mercifully, they stopped. Because hands that have done a thing 10,000 times We'll keep doing it, even when the mind has gone to pieces. She split the bones. She coaxed the fire. She let the barley go slow and patient the way the good barley wanted, and she did not stint the time. And she did the one thing she had always done that Vesna said was either her greatest gift or a sign of a soft head. She cooked it like it was going to someone she loved. She did not know how to cook any other way. No one had ever taught her the trick of not caring. The king worked. Advisors came and went, murmuring. He answered them low, made notes in the margins of reports, and did not once look at the far end of the room where a scullery cook was quietly filling his chamber with the smell of marrow and thyme and wood smoke. Then, somewhere in the second hour, his pen went still on the page. Marin was ladling the barley into a bowl. Her own cheap clay, she noticed. Dagon had found her bowl and brought it here, and she did not have time to feel strange about that when she looked up and found the king's head had lifted. Ha! His nostrils flared. The exhausted gray eyes had come open all the way, sharp now, fixed on the bowl in her hands, with an intensity that stopped her breath. The great gray wolf inside him woke. She felt it, the way you feel a horse startle in the next stall. A shift in the air, a pressure, something enormous turning its head toward her. "Bring it here," the king said. She brought it. She set it in front of him and stepped back, and he ate. Not with the desperate half-mad hunger of the great hall, but slowly this time, deliberately, his eyes closing on the first mouthful. And she watched something extraordinary happen. She watched the shaking in his hands ease. She watched color come back into his gray face a little, the way warmth comes back into fingers held to a flame. She watched a man who had been drowning take his first real breath. When it was gone, he set the spoon down and put his face in one hand, and for a moment, just a moment, the king of Embervale looked like he might weep from sheer relief. Then he remembered she was there. His hand came down. The wall came up behind his eyes so fast she almost missed it happening. "Thank you," he said stiffly. "You may go." Marin fled. She made it all the way back to the kitchens before her legs gave out, and she sat down hard on a sack of flour in the storeroom, and stayed there until Vesna found her. Mistress Vesna was a wide, iron-haired woman with forearms like a blacksmith's and a face that had frightened 3 generations of apprentices into competence. She took one look at Marin on the flour sack and shut the storeroom door. "Tell me," she said. "I can't," Marin whispered. Dagon said. Dagon. Vesna's mouth thinned. "The beta." She crossed her arms. "Child, I have been feeding this household since before that man could walk. There is very little happens in Vaskold I don't hear about by supper. What I want to know is whether you understand what you've done." "I made barley," Marin said helplessly. "I made barley, Vesna, that's all. Twice now. And he ate it. And he looked like..." Her voice wavered. "What's wrong with him? Why won't he eat? A man can't just stop eating." Vesna was quiet for a long moment. Then she sat down on the flour sack beside Marin, which she had never done, and which frightened Marin more than anything else that had happened. "What I'm about to tell you does not leave this room," Vesna said. "That's never a good beginning." Marin said faintly. "No," Vesna agreed. "It isn't." She looked at the door, then at her own scarred hands. "The rumors are true. The king's wolf won't take food. Not properly. Not for more than a mouthful or two, and then it turns to ash in his mouth. His word. Ash, and the wolf refuses it. It's been so since the hunger winter, when he broke the siege at Greywall, more than a year now." Marin's stomach dropped through the floor. "A year! That would kill an ordinary man in a month. He's an alpha, a shifter. The wolf has kept him standing this long on almost nothing, burning himself down to the bone to do it." Vesna's jaw worked. "But even a wolf has a bottom to the well. Dagon thinks he has 3 months, maybe less." She turned and looked at Marin, and her eyes were doing something complicated. "We have tried everything, child. Every cook in the valleys, every dish, every trick, every rare thing that ever coaxed a sick man to eat. He turns them all away." A pause. "And then a scullery girl carries up the staff's own supper and his wolf eats out of her hands like she's the last warm thing in the world. The fire popped in the great kitchen hearth beyond the door. Somewhere an apprentice dropped a pot and swore. "You think it's me," Marin said. Her voice had gone very small. "You think it's something about me." Vesna did not answer, which was an answer. "That's not possible," Marin whispered. "I'm nobody. I'm a foundling." They left on the kitchen step. "I don't have..." "There's nothing special about..." The storeroom door opened. Dagon stood in it, and his face was grave. "The king woke a quarter hour after you left him," he said. "Ate nothing since. It's already going." He looked between the two women. "He wants you at the private hearth tonight. Every night. Until we understand this, a beat. Sundown. Don't be late." And Marin, sitting on a sack of flour, with the smell of the king's chamber still in her hair, felt the whole shape of her small, careful life quietly come apart. That evening a guard led her up through the parts of Vaskhold she had never been permitted to see, the high floors, where the stone was warmer and the tapestries were whole, and the servants moved like they were afraid of being noticed. Why the private hearth? Marin thought, half panicking. Her mind, traitor that it was, went somewhere it absolutely should not. And her face went hot in the dark. Surely a king did not summon a scullery cook to his rooms at sundown for, no. Absolutely not. She was here to make barley, and she would do well to remember it. The guard stopped at a set of carved doors, and knocked once. "Come," said the king's voice. His chamber was the largest room she had ever stood in, and it had a proper cook's hearth built into one wall. Recently, by the look of the clean stone. Whoever had done this had done it in a hurry and had done it for her. On the bench sat her ingredients, her thyme, her cheap clay bowl, and by the window, silhouetted against the last of the light, stood King Rurik. He turned when she came in. "Your Majesty, I'm so sorry," Marin blurted, because apparently that was simply how she was going to open every conversation now. About the Great Hall, the turnips. "I promise I'll never tell a soul you ate my..." "That you..." the king frowned. "What?" "They were bruised," Marin said, digging the hole deeper with tremendous efficiency. "The turnips. I cut the bad parts out. I always cut the bad parts out. But there wasn't time to..." She stopped. "You should have had better." There was a beat of absolute silence. Then the king cleared his throat. "The barley was very good," he said, and looked deeply uncomfortable saying it. It was the first thing he had said to her that wasn't a command, and his voice was lower and quieter than it had any right to be, and it did something unwelcome to the backs of her knees. "This is a practical arrangement," he went on, crossing his arms, a movement that drew her attention, unhelpfully, to the breadth of him even wasted as he was. "You will cook here, in the evenings. You will speak of it to no one. Is that understood?" Marin nodded mutely. And then, because her mouth had never once in her life consulted her before speaking, added, "I'm not going to sleep with you." The king went very still. "I mean," Marin said, wishing for the floor to open, "I only..." "The high floor at sundown, I thought, some people might think, and I'm saving myself so..." "You thought I summoned you here," the king said slowly. "With a cooking hearth, when you put it like that, it does sound stupid," Marin admitted. And King Rurik Faskar, ender of the Salt Ridge Rebellion, breaker of the siege at Greywall, made a short, rough sound that she realized with astonishment was a laugh. It seemed to surprise him more than it surprised her. He shut it down at once, but she had heard it, and she filed it away somewhere. She would not admit to keeping. "Cook," he said. "Please." So, she cooked. He worked at his table while she did, and she filled the great cold room with warmth and the smell of marrow and thyme. She was aware of him the whole time in a way she had no words for. The weight of a man who filled a room simply by being tired in it. When the barley was ready, she set the bowl in front of him and stepped back. The way you step back from a wild animal you're trying not to spook. He looked at it a long moment. Then he ate slow, this time, careful, eyes closing on the first mouthful, and she watched the shaking leave his hands and color climb back into the gray ruin of his face. Watch the enormous presence of his wolf settle like a great hound easing down before a fire. He ate every grain, tipped the bowl for the last of it, then caught himself doing it, and set it down with a care that was almost violent. "When did you last keep a whole meal down?" Marin asked before she could stop herself. "Before the Great Hall, I mean." The king was quiet. "I don't remember," he said finally. "It's been a long while since anything stayed food long enough to swallow." She didn't know what he meant by stayed food, and something in the flat way he said it told her not to ask. The question had a floor she wasn't ready to stand on. "Well," she said instead, gathering her pot. "There's more where that came from. Barley's cheap, and I'm stubborn." The corner of his mouth moved. "So I'm learning," he said. "You'll come tomorrow," he said. Not quite a question. "I'll come tomorrow," she agreed. That night, for the first time, it happened. She was scrubbing the last pot at the little hearth, half listening to the king's breathing, where he'd finally slumped in his chair by the fire. The food had done that. She was learning, given him enough ease to doze, where a year of exhaustion couldn't. She heard his breath go rough. She turned, and the room was gone. She stood in gray. Not fog, exactly, smoke. Thin and cold and endless, that smelled of ash, and old grease, and something underneath it that made her stomach turn, the particular reek of a kitchen where the fires have gone out and the food has been left to rot. There was no floor she could see. There was no ceiling. There was only the smoke, and a long, long table stretching away into the gray, farther than any table had a right to, and at the table sat people. Rows of them, thin as winter branches, their hands folded before empty wooden bowls. She could see the shapes of their skulls beneath their skin. They did not eat, because there was nothing to eat, and never had been. They only sat patient and starving, waiting for a meal that was never ever going to come. And the terrible thing, the thing that put a cold finger down her spine, was that they were not angry about it. They had waited so long they had forgotten there was anything to be angry about. The nearest of them slowly turned its head toward her, and its eyes were the flat gray of a banked ember gone dead. The air moved with the smell of it, not rot, exactly, but absence, a hearth cold, so long, the stone had forgotten it was ever warm. Marin's own stomach cramped with a hunger that was not hers, and for one dizzy moment she understood, in her body, what it was to starve, slowly, with your hands folded and your mouth shut. "Hello?" Marin whispered, and the smoke swallowed the word whole, the way deep snow swallows sound. 10 feet away, the king stood with his back to her, staring down the length of that terrible table. His hands were fists at his sides. His shoulders were a wall. "Your Majesty?" Marin said, and took a step toward him. The starving thing at the table began, very slowly, to rise. She did not think. She crossed the space and grabbed the king's hand. She blinked, and they were back. The chamber, the banked fire gone low and red. The king asleep in his chair, breath steady again, face slack and peaceful, as though nothing at all had happened. Marin stood beside him with her heart slamming against her ribs, and his hand still caught in hers, warm and solid and real. She let go slowly. She backed toward the door. Her hands would not stop shaking, and there was ash on her tongue. Actual ash, gritty and cold, though she had cooked nothing that could leave it there. Dagon was in the corridor, as if he'd been waiting. He took one look at her face, and his own went carefully still. "What did you see?" he said. "Not, are you all right? Not what's wrong. Straight to what did you see? The way a man asks, who already knows there is something to be seen." "Nothing," Marin said. "I'm tired, it's late." Dagon studied her for a long, uncomfortable moment. Then he nodded once, slowly, and stepped aside to let her pass. But as she went, he said low, to her back, "If you ever do see something in there with him, you come to me. Not the healers, not Vesna, me." A pause, and something in his voice she couldn't place. "You're not the first to sit that hearth, Marin. You're only the first his wolf hasn't turned away." She stopped. She wanted to ask what had happened to the others. She did not want to hear the answer badly enough to stay. What, she thought, all the way down the dark stairs, was that? She told Vesna almost everything the next morning. Almost. She told her that the barley worked, every time, without fail. She told her that the king had laughed, which made Vesna's eyebrows climb toward her iron hairline. She did not tell her about the smoke, or the long table, or the starving things sitting patient before their empty bowls. That she had decided somewhere in the small hours had been a fever dream born of exhaustion and the sheer impossibility of her week. It had to be. The alternative was a thing she was not ready to hold. And so a rhythm formed the way rhythms do. In the mornings, Marin woke before dawn and did her scullery work because she was still, whatever else was happening, a cook of the household, and the turnips did not peel themselves. In the daytime she did not see the king at all. Their lives ran on separate tracks, his of maps and councils and the weight of a realm, hers of marrow bones and bruised vegetables and the small brutal politics of a kitchen. And in the evenings she climbed to the high floor, and she cooked, and he ate, and he slept, and she scrubbed her pot and went home. He barely spoke to her those first evenings. He worked, he grunted, he thanked her stiffly and let her go. And every night she waited, tense as a drawn bow, for the smoke to come and take her, but it didn't. Whatever it had been, it seemed content to leave her be. The king slept his shallow hour by the fire, and no gray table stretched away into nothing, and Marin almost let herself believe she had imagined it. Small things began to appear. The first was the time. She had assumed someone was cutting it for her. But one evening she caught the king himself at the window, and on the sill grew a little pot of it, green and thriving in the last of the light. He said nothing about it, neither did she. But it was there every night after that, and it was always fresh. The second was the bench. Her cook's bench had been a rough plank the first night. By the fourth it had been sanded smooth, and a stool set beside the hearth, so that she did not have to work bent double, and when she looked at the king, he was very intent on his correspondence, and the tips of his ears had gone faintly pink. "Thank you for the stool," she said, unpinning her hair as the barley went slow over the fire. "I don't know what you mean," said the king to his reports. She bit back a smile. She started talking, after that, not about anything that mattered. She told him about the apprentice, Call, who had once confused the salt crock with a crock of powdered lye, and very nearly poisoned the entire guard barracks, and who had spent a memorable afternoon being chased around the yard by a sergeant. She did not know when the king stopped working to listen, but in the morning as she gathered her things he said, without looking up, "This apprentice, Call, did the guards forgive him?" Marin froze. He had been listening. He remembered. "Eventually," she said. "It helped that the sergeant's arm went down after a week." "His arm?" "He'd been rubbing the lye on a rash," Marin said. "Long story." The king was quiet a moment. "The apprentice was you," he said. "Wasn't it?" "What?" Marin said, far too fast. "No, I would never. Absolutely not." He looked up at her, and one dark eyebrow rose, just slightly. "Yes," she admitted. "Yes, fine. It was me. I was 11. And in my defense, the crocks were identical and someone had wiped the labels off, and I have made my peace with it." And the sergeant recovered completely. The king laughed. Not the short, startled sound from before. A real laugh, low and rough and unpracticed, like a door opening on a room no one had been into for a long time. It transformed his whole wasted face. Marin stood there with a pot in her hands and stared at him, and something turned over slowly in her chest, warm and dangerous, and she thought, "Oh no." After that he talked back a little. Never about anything that mattered. Never the war, never the wolf, never the reason a king ate like a starving man out of a scullery girl's clay bowl. But he asked her once where she'd learned to cook, and she told him the truth. No one had taught her. She'd simply been the smallest and most useless child in a busy kitchen. And the only way a useless child earned a place was by being useful, so she had made herself useful at the one bench no one else wanted. She said it lightly, the way she said everything, and did not expect the king to go still across the room, or to say, After a moment, in a voice gone strange, "And who fed you?" Marin had not had an answer. She had never thought to want one. The question sat in her chest for days afterward, like a stone she couldn't quite swallow. One evening, she noticed his hand shaking around the pen before she'd even lit the fire, and said nothing, only worked faster, and got the bowl in front of him sooner, and pretended not to see the naked relief when the shaking stopped. She was learning to read the days on him, the good ones, when the food held till morning, the bad ones, when the wolf ate through him, faster than she could feed it back. There were more bad ones lately. She started making the barley richer and staying a little longer each night, telling herself it was only her job. "We think it's the wild time," Vesna told her a few days later, grinding something with unnecessary force. The court healers dug through the old records. There are cases rare but written down of bloodlines whose cooking carries more than flavor, a settling in it, a thing the body reads as safe, combined with something in your own scent. They think, an omega-adjacent calm. The two together make a meal his wolf can't turn to ash where everything else fails. Marin blinked. "So you're telling me I should, what? Cook for him forever?" "I'm telling you," Vesna said, "that if you want to keep him alive, the records suggest he does best when you're close within arm's reach. When he can smell the cooking and the cook both." She held Marin's gaze. The deepest ease came in the old cases, when the cook stayed through the night. The word night landed in the quiet storeroom, and sat there. "You want me to sleep in the king's chambers," Marin said flatly. "I want you to keep the king alive," Vesna said. "How you square the rest with your saving yourself is between you and the gods, child, but he is dying by inches, and you are the only thing in the realm that slowed it." She picked the pestle back up. "Think on it, but don't think too long. Dagon says he's got worse this week, not better. Some nights he barely sleeps at all, and the food only holds him so far." Marin walked back through the kitchens in a daze, past the great hearth and the hanging copper, and the apprentices bent over their boards, and did not taste the bread someone pressed into her hand. That night, she climbed to the high floor as always, but when she stepped into the king's chamber, the smell hit her first. Wrong, sour, the reek of a sick room under the wood smoke, and then she saw him. He was on the floor by the cold hearth, on his knees, one hand braced against the stone, his head hung down. His whole huge frame was shaking, and the sound coming out of him was low and terrible. Not pain, exactly, but the sound of a body that has finally reached the bottom of its well and found nothing there. Beside him, untouched, sat a bowl someone had brought up in her absence. The court cooks, trying again, or Dagon, desperate, and even from the doorway Marin could see it. The food in it had gone gray, not cold, not spoiled. Ashen, the barley collapsed to something the color of a dead fire, though it could not have been sitting more than an hour. As she watched, a thread of pale smoke curled up off the surface of it and vanished, and the smell reached her. That same wrong smell, absence, and cold stone. The smell of the long gray table. Whatever took him at night was not staying at night anymore. It was reaching for him here, in his own chamber, with the candles still lit. "Your Majesty." She dropped her things and ran to him. He lifted his head, and his gray eyes found her, fever bright and stripped of every wall he'd ever built. "You weren't here," he rasped. "It won't. Nothing works when you're not." He stopped. His jaw clenched against whatever else wanted to come out. "You have to go," he said instead, and it cost him something to say it. "Marin, you have to go, now before." The smoke came up between them like a tide. The smoke took the room. One moment, Marin was reaching for the king, where he knelt on the floor of his chamber. The next, the floor was gone, the fire was gone, and she stood in the cold gray reek of the ash feast, with her hand closed on nothing. This time, she could not pretend. The first time she had told herself it was exhaustion, a tired mind making shapes in the dark. But you did not smell things in dreams. You did not feel cold crawl into the roots of your teeth. She was as awake here as she had ever been anywhere. And that meant the long table was real, and the starving rows folded over their empty bowls were real. And that meant The king came to this place every night, and had come every night for more than a year, and had told no one. Rurik, his name came out of her before she decided to use it. She had never called him anything but Your Majesty. He stood a little way off, his back to her, staring down the length of the table into the gray. He did not turn. His shoulders were a wall, his hands fists, and even from behind she could see that he was diminished here. Not the mountain who filled the great hall, not the wolf. Every soul in Vastcold could feel like weather, but something smaller and grayer and terribly tired. The ash feast had a way of stripping a man down to the thing he believed he was when no one was looking. She went to him. The too soft ground gave under her feet without a sound. She caught his arm. Rurik, look at me. He looked. And his eyes, here, held none of the wall he wore awake. They were open all the way to the bottom, and the bottom was grief. You shouldn't be able to come here, he said, very quietly. No one comes here, it's mine. He said it the way a man says the dead is mine. Not a boast, a sentence handed down. Her eyes went past him, down the rows, and snagged on one figure smaller than the rest, slight, hardly more than a girl, sitting very straight with her thin hands folded and her face turned toward the king, as though she'd been waiting a long time for him to look up. Something about the set of her stopped the breath in Marin's chest. She didn't know why. She would later. And she would wish she didn't. Down the table, one of the seated figures stirred, then another. A dry rustle went through the rows like wind through dead reeds, and the hunger rose up out of the ground again, that terrible borrowed starvation. And this time it reached for her, a cold pull under her breastbone, patient and enormous, as if the place had noticed there was something warm in it and meant to sit her down too. One of the dead began, slowly, to rise. Marin did the only thing she knew how to do. She grabbed the king's hand, held on and pulled, not with her arms, but with something beneath them, some stubborn, warm thing in her chest she had no name for, and the gray tore like wet paper. They were back. The banked fire, the king on his knees on the stone and Marin on hers before him, both shaking, her hand crushed in his hard enough to hurt. His breath came ragged, then steadied. The color that being fed had given him held. He did not let go of her hand. You saw, he said. Not a question. I saw, Marin whispered. The table. All the people. Waiting. She swallowed. That's where you go. Every night. That's why the food. She stopped, because his face had flinched at the word people. Quick, and deep and quickly hidden. Who are they? Go to bed, Marin, he said. And let go, and stood, and turned away. You've done your work. The wolf will sleep now. But he did not sleep, and neither did she. And both of them knew the other was awake in the dark a long time. She told Dagon in the morning, because she'd promised she would, and because she didn't know what else to do with the size of it. He listened without a flicker. When she'd finished, he turned a quill over in his scarred fingers a while. A curse. We've known that much a long time. What we didn't know is that it could be shared. He set the quill down. The others who sat that hearth went home and slept sound. You, it lets close. And where it lets you close, it lets you in. That should not be possible for a stranger, Marin. It's the sort of thing that's possible for. He stopped himself. Vesna wants you to stay the nights now, through till morning. The nearer you are, the deeper he goes. The deeper he goes, the more the wolf mends. A pause. I think she's right. I also think you should say, no, go back to your turnips, and be safe. I'm the king's man. I'll not tell you which of us to heed. Marin thought of the king on his knees, in the smoke with his eyes open all the way to the bottom. I'll stay, she said. So the arrangement changed again, the way arrangements do. A narrow cot appeared in the king's chamber that evening, near her hearth, made up with good wool, and a pillow, plainly requisitioned from somewhere far above a scullery cook station. Marin looked at it, then at the enormous bed across the room, and felt her face heat, for reasons she declined to examine. You'll cook, you'll sleep there. I'll sleep there, that's all, said the king to his reports. I didn't say anything, said Marin. Your face said several things, said the king. She cooked. He ate. The color came back. And when the candles were pinched out, she lay on her cot, with her back very straight, and listened to him breathe, across the dark, slow, rationed breaths. A man hoarding rest, the way you hoard grain, in a bad winter. The breaths deepened. He slept, and, in the smallest hour they changed, went rough and quick, the great frame tensing, a low sound climbing his throat that she had learned meant the smoke was rising. She was off the cot before she'd decided to move. She found his hand in the dark and closed hers around it. "I'm here. I've got you. Stay." His fingers clammed down. Desperate, she braced for the gray to take her. It didn't. The rough breathing eased. The tension left the huge hand in hers by degrees. And then he was deep and slow again, and had not woken, because she had caught the smoke at the door, and held it shut with nothing but her hand in his. Marin knelt on the cold stone with his hand in hers, and did not dare move, for fear of waking. Whatever grief lived under his sleep, her knees ached, her spine went stiff. She stayed. And somewhere in the staying, her own eyes slid shut, and she slept there kneeling, her forehead against the edge of his mattress, her hands still folded into his. She woke at dawn to find that at some point in the night she'd been lifted, that the king, half in sleep, had drawn her up out of the cold, and tucked her against his chest, under the good wool, one heavy arm across her like a bar, his breath slow and even in her hair. For a few breathless seconds, she did not move, because moving would end it, and she was greedy. She who had trained herself her whole life to want nothing, to take up no room, to need no one. She lay in the circle of his arm, and let herself be greedy for the length of 10 heartbeats. His chest rose and fell against her back. His hand had spread open over her ribs, as though even in sleep he were counting them, making sure of her. She could feel his heartbeat, unhurried, and the warmth of him soaking through the wool, and she thought that she finally understood why the barley worked. She had never once cooked it for a stranger. She had cooked it, every night of her life, for exactly this, long before she knew his name. And her wolf, the small, quiet wolf she'd carried her whole life and never once felt stir. The wolf, a foundling, had no bloodline. To explain, woke up. It did not growl. It did not frighten her. It simply lifted its head, deep under her ribs, and looked at the man wrapped around her, and thought, with a certainty that stopped her breath, "Mine." Marin lay very still in the gray dawn, and thought, "Oh, no, oh, no, no." For a handful of nights, Marin let herself believe it might be simple. The king slept. That was the miracle she kept turning over like a stone worn smooth, whole nights of it, waking with color in his face, and something unclenched in his shoulders, eating his barley in the morning with steady hands. Sass, once, memorably, he complained she'd gone heavy on the time, which was the most ordinary thing anyone had ever said to her, and made her absurdly happy the rest of the day. He talked more, in the dark. Never about the table, never about the smoke. She'd learned not to reach for that door, because every time she brushed it, he went somewhere cold and far. But he told her other things. That he'd had an elder brother once, who was meant to be king and would have been better at it. That he took his meals in his chamber, not from grief, but because 400 people watching him chew made him want to climb out a window. That he thought her laugh was too loud, and had come, God help him, to listen for it. "You leave a lantern lit for me," she said one night into the dark, once she'd worked up the nerve, by the cot, every night. "You think I don't notice?" A long silence. Then, "I don't know what you mean," said the king of Embervale, and she heard him smile. Dagon noticed the change before she did. He caught her on the kitchen stair one morning, and for once, the watchful face had eased. "Whatever you're doing," he said, "keep doing it." He sat a full council yesterday without gripping the table. He argued with Bram, threatened to have the man scout declared treason. A pause. "I haven't heard him bait anyone in a year." "I'd forgotten he did it." "It's just the barley," Marin said. "It's not just the barley," said Dagon, and left it there. And it wasn't. Marin had begun to feel him, the part she told no one. When she worked in the kitchens and he sat 3 floors above in council, she could feel the shape of his mood, the way you feel weather coming. A pressure, a direction. When he slept well, she woke, rested. When the smoke brushed him, she felt its cold in her own chest, faint as a draft under a door. She told herself it was fancy. She told herself a great many things that season. One night, lying down onto the cot, her hand found his in the dark without either of them deciding it should, and neither let go, and neither spoke of it. And she lay there with her pulse in her throat, and his calloused fingers laced through hers, and thought she could be content to do exactly this until she died, which was, she understood even then, precisely the kind of thought that gets a person like her punished. She should have known. Warm things did not last for people like her. She'd learned that on a kitchen step in the cold before she was old enough to remember learning it. But she let herself forget for a handful of nights. That was the mistake. The first warning came on the fifth night, and she almost missed it. She surfaced from sleep into gray, not the chamber, the smoke. She stood alone in the ash feast, with no king anywhere in it, only the long table stretching away, and the folded rows of the starving dead. And for one heartbeat, the whole terrible place seemed to notice her, all those dead gray eyes turning her way at once, before she jerked awake on the cot with her heart hammering and the taste of ash on her tongue. The king slept on across the room, deep and undisturbed. It hadn't taken him tonight. It had reached past him, into the room, for her. She lay awake till dawn, and told no one. That was the second mistake, and the one she would not forgive herself. It came in full on the sixth night, and it came fast. She was in the ash feast before she understood she'd gone. No rough breathing to warn her, no slow slide into the smoke, just the chamber and then the gray, as if the place had stopped waiting to be invited. The king was ahead of her, down the endless table, his back turned, but the cold pull under her breastbone was not patient now. It was hungry. It had decided about her. She took a step toward him, and the ground tilted her sideways, toward the table, toward an empty chair and an empty bowl that had, she saw with a lurch of pure animal horror, been set for her, a place laid, her place. A hand closed around her wrist, dry and light as a bundle of sticks, and pulled, and every seated corpse turned its hollow gaze on her at once, and the hunger opened under her like a floor giving way. Marin. She had never heard him make that sound. The king came down the length of the table, not like a tired man, but like the wolf the songs were afraid of. He tore the dead hand off her wrist, dragged her back against his chest, and pulled the way she had pulled for him. And the gray ripped, and they fell out of it together onto the stone of his chamber, tangled, gasping. Neither moved. She could feel his heart slamming. She could feel his arms around her, shaking. Then he set her away from him, got to his feet, and when he turned back, his face had closed like a door slammed against a storm. "Get out," he said. Marin scrambled up. "Rurik! You saw it lay a place for you. You felt it. It has your scent now, and it will keep reaching. And one of these nights I will not be quick enough, and you will sit down at that table and you will not get up." He was breathing hard. "I would rather starve. Do you understand? I would rather the wolf go down than pull one more soul into that place. Go back to the kitchens. Don't come back. You'll die." Her voice cracked down the middle. "Without me, then I'll die," he said, "having not done that. That's not yours to decide." Her voice shook, but it did not fall. "You don't get to lay down your life to keep my hands clean. I'm not a bowl of food you can push away, because it costs you something to swallow it." She took a step toward him, and he took one back, actually retreated. A man who had broken armies, giving ground before a scullery cook. And if she'd had room in her for anything but grief, she might have laughed. "Let me help you. There's a way through this. Vesna says the curse shouldn't even hold this strong. Something's keeping it lit, something we haven't found, and there is nothing to find." His voice was iron. "Some debts don't have a door. Go home, Marin." And when she still didn't move, when she stood there with her hand out and her whole foolish heart in her face, he roared it, the sound cracking off the stone. "Go!" She went. She grabbed her shawl with hands that wouldn't work, and ran, and the door boomed shut behind her. and she stood in the cold, high corridor with the sound still ringing and pressed both palms flat to the wall and tried to remember how to breathe. He'd sent her away to save her. She understood that. It didn't help. Under her ribs, the small wolf that had woken in his arms turned a tight, miserable circle and began, very quietly, to grieve. It had been 7 days since the king threw her out of his chambers. 7 days since she'd slept in the warm dark with his breath in her hair. 7 since the wolf under her ribs had lifted its head and ruined her life by deciding whose she was. She'd gone back to the scullery. She'd peeled the turnips. She'd given Vesna a shortened, cowardly version that the king had judged the arrangement too dangerous and sent her home. And Vesna had looked at her far too long and said nothing, which was worse than anything she could have said. The trouble was that Maren was falling apart. It started small. She couldn't sleep, she who had always dropped off the moment her head touched the pallet. Now, she lay awake with a hollow ache under her breastbone, in the exact spot the ash feast had reached for her, except this was worse. This was him, the absence of him. A cold wrongness no blanket touched. Then her appetite went, and wasn't that the cruelest joke in the world, that the cook who kept the king alive with barley now looked at a full bowl and felt her own stomach turn to ash. She who fed everyone could not make herself eat. Her wolf paced. It had slept her whole life, and now it would not lie down, circling and circling behind her ribs, like a dog at a locked door. She got headaches that drove her into a dim corner with her hands over her eyes. She dropped things. She wept once, without warning, over a pot of stock, and told Call it was the onions. Vesna caught her not eating on the 4th day. She said nothing at the time, only set a heel of new bread and a bowl of good drippings at Maren's elbow, and watched, arms folded, until Maren pushed it away with a mumbled excuse. Then Vesna's hard face did something Maren had never seen it do. It softened. "You daft child," she said, almost gently. "You've gone and caught it too, haven't you?" "Caught what?" "His trouble, the not eating." Vesna sat down heavily across from her. "I wondered. I hoped I was wrong." She studied Maren a long moment. "How bad?" "I'm fine," Maren said, a lie so transparent that neither of them bothered with it. And Vesna only sighed, got up, and went back to her grinding, and the untouched bread sat between them like an accusation. On the 5th night, the pole got its hands properly into her. She came to herself in the dark corridor outside the kitchens, with no memory of rising, barefoot on the cold stone, 3 steps toward the stair that climbed to the high floor, toward him. Before she understood, she was walking in her sleep to a man who had ordered her gone. She went back to bed, shaking, and wedged a stool against her door, as if a stool could keep out a thing that was already on the inside. She saw the king twice. Once across the middle courtyard, tall and unmistakable even at a distance, thinner than before, and he'd felt her looking. She knew, because the line of his shoulders changed. He didn't turn his head. The second time was worse. They passed in a corridor, close enough that his scent hit her, and her whole body lit like a struck match, and he looked straight through her as though she were a draft from a window, and walked on. The kitchens talked, the way kitchens do. The king had collapsed in a war council. They said, no, he'd only stumbled. He'd stopped taking meals entirely again. He'd shut himself in his chambers and turned the healers away at the door. Dagon had been seen coming out of the royal apartments with the face of a man arranging a funeral. Maren stood at her board with her knife, going mechanically through an onion. She couldn't smell, and let each rumor land in her chest like a stone dropped down a well, because she could feel that they were true. She could feel him guttering, 3 floors up, like a lamp run dry. He was starving himself to keep her out of the smoke. He was keeping his word, and it was going to kill him, and it was going to kill her, and the 2 of them were going to die, on opposite sides of a wall, out of sheer stubborn love, and call it protection. Seds. By the 7th day she could barely stand upright. That afternoon, Counselor Bram sent down for a restorative broth. His gout again, and Vesna, watching Maren sway over the chopping block, should have sent someone else. She didn't. Later, Maren understood why. Vesna, who missed nothing, had been building a trap out of a sick girl and a bowl of broth, because she decided the king would only be moved by seeing. Marin carried the tray up on legs that weren't hers. The council chamber door stood open. She heard Bran complaining, Dagon answering low, and under them, a voice that went through her like a blade under the ribs. His. He was there. She stepped in. The room tilted gently, like the deck of a boat. Your broth, counselor, she said, distantly proud that the words came at all. She crossed toward Bram, aware of the king to her left at the head of the table, head bent over a map, jaw tight. She willed him to look up. He didn't. She set the tray down, the bowl clinked against the wood, and the sound came from very far away, and the gray crept in at the edges of her sight, the way it crept in at the edges of the ash feast, and she thought, dimly, oh, that's what this is. She heard the tray strike the stones. She heard her name, Marin. Torn out of a voice she'd have known at the bottom of the sea, cracked wide open and utterly undone. Then strong arms caught her before she hit the ground, and she was hauled against a chest she knew, and hands cradled her head, and above her, someone was snarling at the whole room to get back, fetch the healer, move, in a voice with the wolf all the way up in it. The last thing she felt, before the dark took her, was his heartbeat, going like a war drum against her cheek, and she thought, with the small, warm, foolish part of her that had never learned better, he came. She woke to dried herbs and clean linen and wood smoke, her own narrow room off the kitchen's, but wrong, because a fire burned in a grate that never held one, and a chair was drawn up to her cot, and in the chair, bent over with his head in his hands, sat the King of Embervale. He heard her stir, his head came up, and the relief that broke across his ruined face was so total, so naked, that she had to look away from it. You're awake, he breathed, hands hovering over her, like he wanted to touch, and didn't dare. You stopped eating. It wasn't a question, his voice was wrecked. Vesna told me, you've been sick as long as I have. You've been starving in your own kitchen, and you said nothing, and he broke off, dragged a hand down his face. I sent you away to keep you out of the fire, and I've been burning you down from a distance the whole time. Gods, Marin, look at you. You should talk, she rasped, her voice a thread. I've seen healthier corpses. You look like something the ash feast spat back out for being too grim. A sound came out of him that was half a laugh and half a sob. He pressed his forehead briefly to the edge of her cot, and she felt the fine tremor running through him, the fear he'd carried for 7 days, and she wanted to lift her hand to his hair and did not have the strength. In the doorway stood Vesna, arms folded, and Dagon beside her grave as a headstone. It was Vesna who spoke, in the flat voice of a woman done watching 2 fools starve themselves on opposite sides of a wall. Good, you're both here. She looked at the king. Then it's past time somebody in this room told the truth, all of it, starting, your majesty, with what you did at Greywall. The king was quiet a long time. The fire in the grate, that never held a fire, ticked and settled. When he finally spoke, his voice had gone flat and careful, each word set down like a man laying stones over something he could not bear to look at. Greywall was a holdfast on the northern border, Hagen's people. He'd raided the valley steadings 3 winters running, burned grain stores, driven off cattle, left farmers to starve so his own pack wouldn't. I sent envoys twice. He sent them back with a refusal, I'll not repeat, and no interest in peace. His jaw worked. There was going to be a war. That much I couldn't stop. Marin lay still on the cot and watched his gaunt, careful face, and did not interrupt. I could have stormed the walls, thrown my wolves at the gate and taken it in a night, the way the songs say I take things. It would have been a slaughter, theirs and mine both, hundreds dead in the mud by dark. He closed his eyes. So I thought I was being merciful. I ringed Greywall instead. Cut the roads, the river, every way in and out. I would starve Hagen into opening the gate without a single blade drawn. A clean siege, a kind one. The word came out of him like something rotten. I did not let myself think about who else was behind those walls. The winter came early that year, Dagon said quietly from the door. Worst in living memory. They named it after. The hunger winter, Marin whispered. She'd been a child, but she remembered it. The kitchens rationed, beggars at the gate, cold that split stone. Hagen had grain enough for his fighters. He fed his warriors and let the rest go hungry, the old, the sick, the ones too weak to lift a blade. Because a warlord's pride weighs more to him than the people he swore to keep. The king's hands had closed to fists, on his knees. I sat outside those walls, 11 weeks, telling myself that any hour now he'd see sense and open the gate. He never did. And behind the wall, while I congratulated myself on my mercy, they starved. When the gate finally opened, it wasn't surrender. It was the survivors too weak to hold it shut. The room was very quiet. You couldn't have known, Dagon said, not defending him, only stating it. The way he stated everything. None of us knew how bad it had got inside. Hagen kept his own starving well back from the walls. We'd have stormed the gate in a heartbeat if we'd seen a single hollow-cheeked child on the parapet. I should have seen anyway. The king's voice left no room for it. A better king smells a lie on the wind. I let myself believe the kind story, because the kind story let me sleep at night. He laughed, a broken scrape of a sound. For all the good that did me, in the end, there was a girl. His voice finally cracked. Near the end, she came over the wall in the dark, climbed down alone, half-starved a child, and crossed the whole ring of my army to reach my tent. She'd come to beg, not for herself, for the little ones. She had a list of their names. He drew a shaking breath. My sentries didn't know her for a child in the dark. They thought her a trick of Hagen's. I heard the shouting. By the time I came out, he stopped. He could not say it. He did not have to. Nev, Marin said softly. She didn't know how she knew. She had seen the girl at the long tables sitting so straight, her face turned up as if she'd waited years for him to look. Her name was Nev. The king stared at her with something like terror. How could you? She's there. At the table, in the smoke. She's still waiting for you. He put his face in his hands. When he spoke again, the words came muffled through his fingers. She had freckles. I never told anyone that. I don't know why it's the thing that stayed with me. A starving child crossed a battlefield to save her friends, and what I kept was her freckles, and the way she looked at me at the very end, like she couldn't understand why I hadn't simply helped. He dragged his hands down his ravaged face. I have seen that look every night for a year. I could draw her in the dark. He told the rest fast, the way a man gets through the last of a wound. When Greywall fell, they found the storerooms and the starved, and among the dead who could no longer be helped was a woman, Hagen's mother, or his seer, no one ever knew, who had held on out of pure hatred long enough to see the king's face. Fida, her name was. She had looked at Rurik Vaskar, standing stricken among the lost of Greywall, the ones he'd meant to spare, and spat her curse through cracked lips with the last of her breath. You, who filled no bowl, the king recited, in the toneless voice of a man who had heard the words every night for a year. May your wolf never know fullness again. May every meal turn to ash in your mouth. And every night may the ones you starved sit at your table and wait for the bread you never brought. He opened his hands. She spent the last of her breath on it. It was enough. Vesna had gone very still. Now she spoke slow and frowning. I know that shape of curse. A grief-binding, vengeful, cruel. But they burn out. The magic's tied to the caster's own life, and she spent hers making it. A binding like that should have guttered inside a season. A year on, still this strong, still dragging you into that place every night. She shook her head. That's not the witch keeping it lit, your majesty. She's a year in the ground. Something else is feeding it. Then let it feed, the king said, and stood the wall slamming back up behind his eyes. It changes nothing. Marin does not go near the smoke again. I've said so. And he left the way. He left every conversation that came too close to the wound, fast, without looking back, before anyone could get a hand to him. The door shut. Marin stared at it. Vesna sat on the edge of the cot and took Marin's cold hand in both her warm, scarred ones. You know what you are to him. Say it. His mate. Marin whispered. The word had been under her tongue for weeks. That's why I can feed him when no one else can. That's why being apart is, her voice broke. That's why I'm dying too, isn't it? An unfinished bond, pulling both ways. The longer you deny it, the harder it hauls. And if his curse takes him down, it takes you with it. Vesna's old eyes were kind and terrible. Hear me, child, because it's the truest thing I know. You can lead a starving man to the finest table in the 7 valleys. You cannot make him lift the spoon. He has decided he belongs at Neve's table, that the debt is his to pay with his life. That's what feeds the curse, not the witch. Him. You cannot feed a man who has chosen to starve. Then there's a way to make him, Marin said. Break it from the outside, a counter-charm. Something. You're not listening. Vesna's voice was not unkind. The witch's binding is a dead thing, a lock with no one left holding the key. Any hedge charmer could have picked it a season after she cast it. It stays shut, because he keeps his own hand on it. Burn every witch mark off that man, and he'd walk back into the smoke on his own 2 feet by moonrise, because he believes that is where he ought to be. She spread her scarred hands. The curse is only the door. He is the one standing in it, refusing to come out. From the doorway, Dagon spoke, quiet. I've watched better healers than me try everything that can be done to a man. None of it touched him. He looked at Marin, steady. You're the first thing that ever reached him instead. That's not herbs, and it's not luck. That's the bond. Whatever the 2 of you are to each other, it's the only road into that place that doesn't run through the witch's lock. Which means if anyone alive can walk him back out of it, it's you. A pause. And it may well kill you to try. Both of those are true at once. I'll not pretend otherwise to spare you. Marin thought about a kitchen step in the cold. About a whole life spent making herself small and useful so no one would have cause to leave her twice. About how long she had believed, in the deepest cellar of herself, that she'd been left because she had not been worth the keeping, and how no argument, no kindness, no proof anyone had ever offered had shifted that belief by so much as an inch, because it had never come in through her ears. It lived somewhere words could not reach. She knew exactly what it was to agree with the thing that was eating you alive, and she knew, better than any healer, that you did not starve such a thing out with logic. You starved it out with someone who flatly refused to leave the table. Watch me, she said, and stood up off the cot on legs that finally held. It was Dagon who got her past the guards, in the end. He found her on the kitchen stair, with her jaws set, and her color still bad, and took one long look at her. He'll have my head. He gave orders. No one, to his chambers. He didn't sound especially troubled by it. Trouble is, a man has to be awake to enforce an order, and His Majesty is currently face down on a council table pretending to read dispatches. He stepped aside. 3rd bell. He'll drag himself up to his rooms to not sleep. Be there before him. After that, you're on your own. And so is he, and so am I when he learns of it. The corner of his mouth moved. Feed him something. Cook. Preferably before he dies of being noble. The king's chamber was dark and cold when she let herself in. The hearth she'd once tended, gone to gray ash. The lantern he used to light for her unlit. She lit it. She knelt at the little hearth, and coaxed a fire up out of nothing, the way she'd coaxed 100 fires, set water on, split the last of the marrow bones someone had left to spoil, and cooked, because it was the only prayer she knew how to say. He came in on the 3rd bell and stopped dead. Rurik, she said, you can't be here, but he didn't move to throw her out. He stood swaying slightly, thinner than she had ever seen him. A great wolf, worn down to the wire, his eyes fixed on her like she was the last warm thing in a cold world, which she was beginning to understand. To him she was. I'm going to keep being here. You can roar at me if you like. I've decided I don't frighten anymore. She crossed to him, and he did not retreat this time, only watched her come with hunger and terror warring across his ruined face. You told me some debts don't have a door. You're wrong. I am the door. You only have to be brave enough to walk through me. If I let you in, he said hoarsely, the smoke takes you too, then it takes us both. But I'd sooner burn beside you than eat alone at a warm table the rest of my life, knowing I left you to starve in the dark. That's not saving myself. That's only a slower way of dying." Something in him broke. She felt it snap through the bond, like a cut rope. He reached for her the way a drowning man reaches, and she was already reaching back. He held her like a man taking his first full breath in a year, his hands framing her face as though he couldn't believe she'd stayed hers, finding the two sharp lines of him and holding on anyway. There was nothing careful in it, and she stopped trying to be careful. "Tell me to stop," he said against her hair, "and I'll stop." "Don't you dare," she said. What passed between them then was slow and unhurried and tender. Two starved people learning at last that they were allowed to be cared for. She had spent her whole life giving, and never once being given to, and he undid that patiently, in the firelight, until she was undone by how much she was allowed to have. When the bond sealed, a warmth blooming at the curve of her shoulder, the unfinished thing between them locking shut, like a key turning home, she felt it settle gold and whole and right, and something in her answered it, and she felt his answering shudder go all the way down. For a while, there was only the fire, and his heart under her ear, and his arms around her like he'd finally stopped apologizing for wanting to keep her. He fell asleep first, deep and sudden and complete, the sleep of a man who has set down a thing he carried too far. Maren lay in the circle of him, felt the warm gold hum of the finished bond, and let herself believe, for one moment, that it had been that simple. Then the smoke rose around them both, and she understood it had never been going to be. She did not fight it this time. She let it take her, and kept her hand fisted in his shirt so it could not part them. And when the gray resolved, she stood in the ash feast with her fingers knotted in his and her chin up. He was already on his knees, of course he was, before the long table, before the endless folded rows of the starved. The great king of Embervale knelt in the ash with his head bowed, like a man at his own sentencing. From the rows, one small figure had risen and come forward and stood before him, now patient, waiting. A girl, thin as a reed, a list still clutched in her wasted hand. "Nev," the king said, and it came out shredded. The girl looked at him with eyes like banked embers. When she spoke, her voice was soft, almost kind, which made it worse. "You could have opened the gate. You could have brought us bread. A better king would have known me in the dark. All of us. That is your account to settle." And Maren understood with a cold drop of horror that these were not the girl's words at all. Nev had come to beg, not to accuse. These were the king's own words, his own verdict, wearing a dead child's face, and read back to him every night for a year. The curse had never needed the witch's power to keep burning. It had his. "He believes her," Maren breathed. She could feel it through the bond, vast and immovable, not fear, agreement. He knelt there and agreed with every word, and had agreed since the gate came down. "That's what feeds it. You think you belong at this table?" "I do," the king said simply, and did not look up. And Maren, foundling, nobody, scullery, cook with ash on her tongue, and a dead child watching, knelt in the gray beside the most dangerous man in the Seven Valleys, and did the only thing she had ever truly known how to do. She did not argue with his grief. You cannot argue a starving man into eating. Instead, she took his face in her hands, made him look at her, and gave him the thing she had never given anyone. "When I was a baby, someone left me on a kitchen step in the cold, and I decided too small to even talk. And somehow, I still decided that they left me because I wasn't worth keeping, that if I'd been better, they'd have stayed. I spent my whole life trying to earn a place at a table I was sure I didn't deserve, feeding everyone, needing no one, making myself so useful that nobody would ever have cause to set me out in the cold again." Her voice shook. "I was wrong, Rurik. It was never a debt. A child on a step doesn't owe the world her whole life just to be allowed to live in it, and neither do you." The dead were silent. Neve watched, the list loose in her hand. "You didn't starve them out of cruelty. You did the kindest thing you could see, and it went wrong in a way no one alive could have carried well. That isn't a debt with your name on it. That's grief, And grief you are allowed to set down. She pressed her forehead to his. You're allowed to be fed. You're allowed to live. Let her rest. Love, let them all rest. You don't have to sit at this table anymore. For a long, terrible moment. Then the king lifted his head and looked at the girl and spoke, not to Marin, but to Nev, to all of them. I'm sorry. I couldn't bring the bread in time. I would give my life to have opened that gate. A breath. But I think you'd rather I put it down than starve to pay you. I think you climbed that wall to save the children, not to keep one more. Nev smiled. It was a child's smile, sweet and tired. She laid the list down on the empty table, closed her eyes, and was gone. Not snuffed out, but released, like a breath let go on a cold morning. And down the long table, one by one, the folded rows of the starved raised their heads, turned, and dissolved into the gray, like steam off a warm bowl. The vast hunger under the ground thinned, and lifted, and was simply gone. The last of the smoke unwound. The king pitched forward into Marin's arms, and she caught him, and held on while a year of grief came out of him in great racking waves against her shoulder. I've got you, she murmured into his hair. I've got you. Put it down. I'll still be here when your hands are empty. They came back to the chamber, tangled together on the floor, before a fire burned down to coals. He, shaking, she, weeping, neither letting go. When he could breathe again, he raised his head, and his eyes, for the first time since she'd met him, were only tired, not haunted, just a man's eyes. Marin, because she was who she was, reached to the hearth without letting go of him, picked up the bowl of barley she'd left, warming on the stone, and put the spoon in his hand. Eat, she said. He looked at it a long moment, then he ate. And it did not turn to ash. It was only food, barley and marrow, and wild thyme, made with far more love than skill, the way it had always been made, and he ate every grain there on the floor with his mate's arms around him, and the tears drying on his face. And when it was gone, he set the bowl down and laughed, wet and disbelieving, at the miracle of a full stomach. It stayed, he said. It stayed, she agreed. The curse didn't break clean, grief doesn't, and neither does healing. Vesna could have told them so and did. At length, more than once. Some nights, the smoke still came, thin and toothless now, and the king woke, reaching for a table that was no longer there. But Marin was beside him every one of those nights, and she would take his hand in the dark and say, "It's gone. Love, they're resting. Come back." And he would. Slowly, over months, the nights went quiet. He learned to eat in a hall full of people again. He learned to say Nev's name without flinching. He learned, hardest of all, to be fed, to let himself be cared for by someone who asked nothing in return, but that he stay alive to be cared for. The court took it about as well as courts take anything. A foundling, a scullery cook, the Alpha King's mate. There were whispers in every corridor, and Marin felt each one, and on the day they spoke, the mating vows before the whole pack, she felt 400 pairs of eyes weigh her and find her wanting. But Rurik's hand was steady in hers, his voice did not waver, and afterward, in the quiet of their chamber, he pressed his mouth to her temple. "They'll come round," he murmured. "And if they don't, they may take it up with their king, who is unreasonably, catastrophically fond of his mate." She never did stop cooking. She'd tried to explain to the stewards that a queen could not also run a hearth, and had been overruled by the queen. But now, on the good mornings, someone cooked for her. She'd come down to find the King of Embervale ruining a pan of eggs with tremendous concentration, having banished the kitchen staff so he could burn her breakfast in private. Because once in the dark she had told him that no one had ever fed her, and he had decided, in the quiet, immovable way, he decided things that this would simply no longer be true. "Who fed you?" he'd asked her once, a lifetime ago, and she'd had no answer. She had one now. They ate the burnt eggs together at a small table in the morning light, the bond humming warm and gold between them. Two people who had each been so sure they deserved to starve, learning, one shared meal at a time, that they were allowed to be full.